Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute, and it's great to see another crowd despite today very attractive weather outside, and great to welcome our friends around the world on the live web stream, and everyone who will be watching this, and I hope on the website and download at their convenience. Today we're going to be talking about the resurgence of the state in the Chinese economy. Before I get to that, which is of course a critical topic, I just want to make clear a couple things. We at the Peterson Institute have ongoing discussions with officials in the Chinese government, business leaders, both state and private sector in the Chinese economy, and with colleagues and scholars in China's academic world as well as government world. My colleagues and I all have differing views on various aspects, but we are committed, I think, all of us, to 2 points. The first being that it is in the interest of the world, as well as China, that the Chinese economy continue to develop and grow in a sustainable, rapid pace, that part of that is marketization, but in a measured and planned way, and that we believe that there is a reform effort that has been ongoing in China, that has paid enormous dividends to date, but that seems to have slowed down at some point in the last couple of years. The second point that I think all of my colleagues would agree on and that I want to point out in the current political environment is that when we make critiques of Chinese economic policy or raise questions in the data or talk about its effects on the rest of the world, it is not with an eye to punching the Chinese government. It is not with an eye to providing ammunition for those who, in a blinded way, assume that everything the Chinese government does is harmful to the U.S. and is unfair. I don't believe that, and the facts don't support that. We continue to call things as we see them, and so we are talking about the Chinese economy today with that in mind, but not to provide ammunition to those who wish to simply attack the Chinese economy and the Chinese leadership, whatever the case. One thing that my colleagues and I all agree on, even if we have differences occasionally about tactics or about the severity of certain situations, is that issues between the U.S. and China in the economic sphere are best resolved through a combination of the rules-based system that the U.S. created over the last 70 years, that China has increasingly and largely adhered to over the last 40 years, as well as constructive bilateral dialogue. That leads me to mention the people we have with us today, but also a new person coming. As many of you saw, last week we had the debut of Jason Furman, the Honorable Jason Furman, the former Council of Economic Advisors chair as a senior fellow at the Institute. I'm delighted today to reiterate the announcement that the Honorable Dr. Nathan Sheets, who recently concluded his public service as Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs and was at the heart of constructive U.S.-China dialogue, both bilaterally and in the G20 process, has now joined the Institute as a visiting fellow for at least the next several months. And he will be continuing to write and think about these issues, and we want to welcome Nathan, and beyond the speakers today, want to encourage him, all of you, to take advantage of Nathan's new presence here at the Peterson Institute. Let me now turn to today's topic more specifically. As I remarked, a number of observers, starting with our own colleague Nicholas Lardy, have of course noticed that the role of the state sector in the Chinese economy seems, at least, to have risen in recent years. And this is probably harmful to Chinese productivity growth and will have both direct and indirect implications for the rest of the world. We have today 3 of our scholars who have different views on how this is going to play out and what the state of affairs is, and obviously some differences between them. But I think together, the 3 speakers today, I'm very proud to have all a part of the Peterson Institute who will give us a picture of what lies ahead in terms of challenges for China and what's the reality for the U.S. and other governments facing the Chinese economy. We will start off with a presentation by Nicholas Lardy, who is, of course, the Anthony M. Solomon Senior Fellow here at the Institute, and the bedrock of our China work has been with the Institute since 2003. Of course, is the leading American analyst of long-standing and scholar of Chinese economy and development, including previous distinguished posts at Brookings Institution as Dean at the University of Washington School of International Studies and at Yale. His latest book for us a couple of years ago now was the widely cited Markets Over Mao, The Rise of Private Business in China. And therefore, I think it is all the more important that as Nick and all of us recognize the enormous benefits that Chinese business development has had for the world economy and for China, to mark when he says there's something going on that affects the private sector. Our second speaker today is Carolyn Freund. Dr. Freund has been a senior fellow at the Institute since May 2013. I'm proud to say she was the first person I hired full-time when I took over as president. She works principally on long-run economic growth, international trade, and the interaction of these two forces. Her extremely creative book, Rich People, Poor Countries, that came out last year, broke new ground on the understanding of the role of creative destruction and business leadership around the world, including China. Carolyn had a distinguished career as a trade and research economist at the World Bank, the IMF, the Federal Reserve Board, and previously as chief economist for the Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank. In particular today, Carolyn is going to be presenting new research she's doing that is driven by a cross-national interest and agenda in her wheelhouse of economic growth and trade, but which turned out to have important information about China, and I will allow her to explain that today. There is her new working paper, which we released today, and which is available, Global Competition, the Rise of China, with Dario Sidhu, one of our young researchers here. And we encourage you to take a copy or download it. It's a very rich paper, not just about China. Finally, I'm delighted to welcome back to our podium Rory MacFarquhar, who joined the Institute as a visiting fellow just a year ago now. We're delighted to have Rory as a colleague. For the previous 6 years before he joined us, he worked in the Obama administration, including for an extended period as a special assistant to the president and net senior director for global economics and finance in the White House, NSC and NEC. He led policy teams on a range of issues, but I think most of us know him as having played a key role in all U.S.-China bilateral economic relations over the last several years, supporting the NSC, the NEC, and the president. He's an outstanding colleague and has a background not only at the practical side of U.S.-China policy relations, but in markets, having previously worked for Goldman Sachs in Moscow and director of economic research for Central and Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So we have a very distinguished group today. All comments are, of course, on the record. I'm going to ask my three colleagues to come up and present in sequence, and then we will have an on-the-record discussion with the distinguished audience here today. Nick, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. I want to begin by just briefly reviewing the attitude that people like me had a few years ago when Xi Jinping, the current leader, first came into power. We had the famous third plenum of the 18th Party Congress that seemed to set a tone that suggested that economic reform was going to accelerate. And I just want to read, there's a very long document, extremely detailed, so I'm not going to give you the details, but I am going to read three parts of it, which I think give you the flavor. The first is the simple sentence: we must ensure that the market has a decisive role in the allocation of resources. That sentence had never appeared in a party document in China since reform began in 1978. They said the market could play a supplementary role and this kind of a role and that kind of a role, but they never said it had to be a decisive role. And then further expanding on that, we must substantially reduce the direct allocation of resources by the government and promote resource allocation based on market principles, market prices, and market competition. And then there was a longer statement that I think could have been made in any market economy that we're familiar with that goes as follows, quote, The functions of the government are mainly to maintain macroeconomic stability, strengthen and optimize public services, guarantee fair competition, strengthen market supervision and management, safeguard market order, and promote sustainable development. All laudable goals that I don't think many people would disagree with. But what is actually, so this led to a tremendous wave of optimism that reform would reaccelerate and we'd see a very transformed economy in a short period of time. But very shortly thereafter, Xi's attention turned from economic reform to his anti-corruption campaign, to enhancing the role of the party at the expense of the government and at the expense of civil society, and to substantially enhancing the role of state-owned companies. And this was very clearly reflected in the 13th five-year plan, which is rolled out only 2 years later, that had a lot of very statist elements I won't go into, but it was a very different tone. And what we've seen is that not very much of the third plenum reform agenda has actually been introduced or adopted or implemented, and people have become much more pessimistic, and it's not just people like me looking at it, but I think foreign firms operating in China have become, had a significant change of attitude. I'll just quote from the most recent survey by the American Chamber of their firms in China, which was just released a few weeks ago. 80% of its members said that they, quote, feel foreign firms are less welcome in China than before, close quote, and 60% expressed a lack of confidence that the Chinese government was committed to further opening up of reform, and I think this was a natural reaction to some of the industrial policies that have gotten more emphasis. Well, those of you who know me, I like to look at the numbers, so I'm trying to look at what's the evidence that there's been a resurgence of the state in the last few years, and I'm going to look at two potential indicators. One has to do with profits of state companies, particularly in the industrial sector, and the other has to do with the role of the private sector and state sector in terms of investment. Now, on the profit side, 2016 was the first time in several years that the growth of profits of state companies surpassed the growth of profits of private companies. You can see that private company profitability has declined, but it turns out that I think this is primarily recovery. 2015 was a terrible year for state-owned companies in China. Their profits declined by more than 20%. So even though they've had a pretty smart recovery this year, their profits in 2016 were actually below the level of 2014. The profits of private companies grew by 5% in 2015, so they were starting from a much higher base, and they've had their profit growth maybe somewhat behind that of state companies, but they're doing pretty well. If you look at it in terms of the share of profits, again, you get a very different picture than the first diagram because registered private companies are producing a pretty constant share of profits in the industrial sector, and you don't see much of a resurgence of state-owned companies. If you add in the profits of limited liability companies that are controlled by private players, the share of private profits in Chinese industry is about 3 times that of state companies, something in the neighborhood of 50-55%, and that has not eroded very much. So I think this is cyclical recovery, not an indicator of a resurgence of the state. The second indicator is a much more serious one, and one which has, I think, much more negative implications, and that is that the role of the state companies in investment has increased quite substantially. You can see the trends here between state and private, and in 2015 was the first year since the global financial crisis in 2009 when state investment ramped up. This is the first year that state investment has grown more rapidly than private investment in recent years. Now, I think, and then you can see the gap has widened substantially in 2016 with a very sharp ramping up of state investment relative to private investment. And I think these numbers have some shortcomings, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them. I want to give you my estimate of the growth of state versus private investment. The blue line is showing us the share of investment undertaken by private companies. The 2.6x simply means that private company investment in the period 2006 up to through 2011 was 2.6 times that of state companies. That accounts for the rising share of investment undertaken by private companies. Starting in 2012, it dropped down to 1.4 times, and so far, the data that we have, it's running at about 0.3 times the growth of state investment. So this is a very substantial increase in the relative importance of state investment as compared to private. Well, those are just the numbers. What I'm going to spend most of my time on is, looking at a couple of possible explanations of why this might be the case. Just to put them out there, the first one is that there are fewer profitable investment opportunities for private firms, and the second one is that there has been a substantial amount of crowding out of private investment over the last few years, particularly starting in 2012. Now, why might it be the case that private firms see fewer investment opportunities? Well, private firms face the fewest barriers to entry in the manufacturing sector. And private firms already account for about 80% of investment in manufacturing. The share of state firms is under 10%. The balance of investment in manufacturing is undertaken by foreign affiliates. So the state has pretty much faded away from the manufacturing sector. You can point to a few exceptions like automobiles where you can only do 50-50 and so forth. But now, what's the nature of the slowdown in the Chinese economy since 2010? It's concentrated primarily in industry and construction, and manufacturing is far and away the biggest component of that. So you see that the growth has declined from roughly 16% down to 6%, relatively large deceleration of growth in manufacturing. And in the service sector, the reduction has been substantially less. I've talked about this before, how the service sector has become more important. But given the fact that private firms have the best investment opportunities in the manufacturing sector, maybe the slowdown means there are just fewer opportunities available. If you look at investment in services, the role of the state is about 5.5 times what it is in the manufacturing sector. Just a lot of barriers to entry. And you can see that a decade ago, the private share was rising slightly, but since around 2011, it's been completely flat. And if you look closely at 2015, I think it went down somewhat. So the state is very, very dominant in investment in services. This is a sector that has been growing, but is not so open to private players. Yes, you can open a personal service business, you can open a restaurant and things like that, but private firms have very difficult time investing in finance, telecoms, transport, and a few other very important sectors. So the first explanation or hypothesis is there are just fewer profitable investment opportunities for private companies, so they've cut back on their investment. The second explanation is crowding out. This is a diagram showing us that the absolute amount of investment undertaken by state companies between 2007 and 2014 very close to doubled. But their retained earnings, that is their after-tax profits, only went up by about 50%. If you updated this diagram to include 15 and 16, investment went up more, but total state profits last year were less than they were in 2014. So that suggests that investment by state companies is increasingly financed by funding. It doesn't suggest, I think it basically proves that investment by state companies is increasingly being funded by sources that are external to the firm. Now, what might those be? Again, this is going back to the long term. You can see in the long term, the share of loans outstanding to state companies had been going down for a couple of decades, and the private share had been rising. That's one of the reasons the private sector had been doing relatively well. And if we look at it on an annual basis for more recent years, you get a very different picture. The state share bottomed out in 2011, then began to rise gradually, and in 2014 it jumped by 25 percentage points. This is the most recent data that has been published. This is not my estimates of this These are the official data of the People's Bank of China. I have a little bit of difficulty with the 2014 numbers, but I don't think there's any question that the long-term rise in the share of bank credit going to private companies has been reversed in recent years, and state companies have been getting better treatment. And, that's roughly consistent with the investment pattern. They start getting better access to credit in 2012. That's when their share of investment was going up. A second component of this crowding out is the corporate bond market. The corporate bond market has expanded quite dramatically in China in recent years. It's become a much more important source of external funding for firms. More than 90% of the issuance by value is by state corporates, not by private corporates. So private corporates can do some issuance, but they're a relatively small part of the market. So that's the second component. And then the third component is the role of the budget in financing investment has increased quite significantly, and this has not gotten much notice. In the old days, about 90% of investment was financed through the budget, and that declined dramatically in the 80s and 90s. But it's now going back up, and I estimate that about 30% of all state investment is now being financed through the budget. So that's another example of crowding out. So I think I can't tell you whether crowding out or the lack of profitable investment opportunities for private firms is the most important. Undoubtedly, there is some of both. Now, let me add quickly that the footprint of private firms, at least in the industrial sector where we have the best data, is still growing very rapid. You look at the growth over this 4-year period, the expansion of private firms in terms of value added in constant prices is roughly, it's close to twice that of state firms. So state firms are still growing very, very slowly relative to private firms. The cumulative growth figures are really quite striking. So it's not that the private sector is fading away, it's that the investment flows look like they're increasingly going to state companies. So let me conclude. I think the resurgence of state profits in the industrial sector appears to be largely cyclical, not any evidence of a state resurgence. But given the huge productivity gap between state and private firms, which now stands at roughly 3-to-1, the continued resurgence in the state investment relative to private, I think, is quite unfavorable for China's economic recovery in at least two respects. Number one is the obvious one. It will mean, if it's continued, it will mean lower growth. And secondly, it means the quality of the portfolios of China's financial institutions will continue to deteriorate because they're lending too much money to state-owned companies that have very, very low returns. So it's adverse for growth, and it's adverse for financial stability. I think the slowing of private investment relative to state is, as I said before, some combination of entry restrictions in services and crowding out of private investment. And I think the policy response that is appropriate, I would argue, is pretty simple. They should further liberalize entry for private firms in services, and I would say not only indigenous private firms, but foreign private firms as well. And they should create a more competitive financial sector, which would lead to a substantial reduction in the lending to the state sector. Thank you.
So let me start by saying where this work came out of, because the original title of this work was Global Competition, and it became Global Competition in the Rise of China when China became the key change to global competition that I saw looking at the data. And the reason I wanted to look at this question of what's happening to global industrial competition, and I'm going to focus on concentration and also allocative efficiency, is that there's a body of new research by Jason Furman, who's now with us, and Peter Ortzag and others, showing that in the U.S., industrial concentration has risen, and this raises concerns about monopoly power, although some recent evidence also shows that it's efficient. The more efficient firms are growing faster and getting bigger, so that's a good thing by David Otter and others. But if you think about these firms competing in a global environment, looking at individual country data isn't the right thing to do because you could have, for example, a textile and apparel firm that's the only firm in the US. It would look like a monopoly, but it would be hard to say that that firm has any kind of market power. So what I wanted to look at was global concentration and global allocative efficiency. And as I said, so given trade and investment, global concentration should capture market structure and market competition to a much greater extent than looking at an individual country. And it's going to raise the same kind of issues or concerns. So if there was a lot of concentration globally in one industry, especially if it was concentrated in a specific country, you might be worried about volatility because what if something happened in that region or country, or some sort of shock to the industry. You could also be worried about market power if some firms grow too large and have too large a share of the market. But again, it could reflect efficiency, and a lot of the work from the 1980s on this topic showed that the most productive firms actually do grow larger, and that industrial concentration is a big part of efficiency gains. So one reason this topic kind of attracts attention is because of these kind of comparisons saying, oh, the big firms have gotten so large, they're as large as the governments of big countries. So there are these kind of rankings that rank firms and countries or government revenues in countries, and this is a ranking of government revenues and firms' revenues together, and Walmart is the 10th biggest country in the world according to this ranking. And if you look at the companies, and in parentheses is where they would rank, 3 of the top firms are Chinese, and they're Chinese state-owned enterprises. So this is already where China's starting to come into the story, that they have a lot of these large firms. There also was this kind of weird economist versus economist story about large firms. On the one hand, saying in the US, the rise in industrial concentration and corporate profits is too much of a good thing. There's too much monopoly power in the US. On the other hand, saying something's happening in Europe and their large firms are losing market share to firms from elsewhere, so something's wrong in Europe. Well, which is it? Are large firms good, or are they, or are losing them a bad thing? But you kind of can't have it both ways. So let's understand what's really happening with big business. China's effect is interesting because what we see is a huge rise in the number of Chinese firms in any list you look at of top firms. And it could have different effects, right? So on the one hand, since the largest firms in the past typically came from Europe, Japan, and the US, the rise of Chinese firms could reduce industrial concentration because now they're taking some of the market share from the incumbent industry leaders. On the other hand, if Chinese firms are somehow different, either because the country's so large, so the firms have been able to grow large, or because they're state-owned, then you could see that the rise of China is associated with an increase in industrial concentration. So just to tell you very briefly, this project is using data from the Orbis database. And the interesting thing about this data is that it doesn't just have publicly listed companies, it also has privately owned companies and state-owned enterprises, and includes ownership information on these companies. I'm going to do 2 splits, one looking at the 84 broad industries, and then do a little bit of work on tradables, because we might think that global industrial concentration matters more in tradable sectors. So I started by saying you look at this and immediately China jumps out. So this is 3 lists of top firms, the top 1,000 from the data I'm using, the top 500 FT has a list, and the top 2,000 Forbes. They rank them a little bit differently. I'm just ranking them based on revenues. The others also look at market value in particular. But any way you cut it, one thing jumps out. The number of Chinese firms in the world's largest has grown dramatically. So in the Orbis data, in 2006, 41 firms were in the top 1,000, now 136 are. And within the top 500 or top 2,000, we've also seen the number of Chinese firms grow by more than a factor 3. The measures I'm going to focus on are the 4-firm concentration ratio, which is just the 4 firms' share of, and it's not going to be the full list of firms in an industry because that's not available. So while the data's complete, there are reasons that it changes over time and such. So we're going to do the top 4 firms out of the top 650 firms in an industry to keep it constant across industries, or the Herfindahl index, which is just the sum of the squares of market shares. And this is a picture showing the share in 2006, and each circle is an industry, and the size of the circle represents how large the industry is in total revenues, and the share in 2014. And if we insert a 45-degree line, so if the share had stayed the same, then the share in 2006 would be the same as the share in 2014, and all the points would line up along the 45-degree line. Actually, most of the points fall below the line. And if you do an average or a weighted average, what you find is that industrial concentration fell by 4 percentage points. And in terms of when we look at the US data or something, that's the same increase that, for example, Furman and Ortzag were worried about in the US data, which was over a much longer period. This is a pretty big drop in a relatively short period of time in industrial concentration. So here's the fitted line. And as I said, the average decline is 4%, 4 percentage points in industrial concentration. Whoops. And again, to highlight the rise of China, if you look at who these superstar firms are, so if we take the top 4 firms by the 84 industries, so 360 some superstar firms, these are the firms that are the largest in their sector, what you see is a jump in China. So China has increased its share of these super large firms, and the area that's declined the most is the European Union. So mainly at the expense of European firms that used to be in the top 4. And so what I did with this data is some regression analysis to look at what is the effect of new emerging market firms on overall industrial concentration? So this idea that as these firms grow, they take share from the incumbent industry leaders from Europe or Japan or Europe, and there is that effect. So an additional 10 emerging market or Chinese firms, it works with China as well, reduces concentration on average by half of 1 percentage point. But the one thing that stood out was it's different when state-owned firms are at the top. So there was a very large increase relative to what was happening everywhere else when a Chinese firm was in the top 4. So having a Chinese firm among the top 4 firms, that industry was likely to increase concentration by about 5 percentage points relative to other industries. So this just shows the, I think it's 13 or 15 industries with and without SOEs. So another way to look at it to see if this is really a causal effect. Maybe Chinese SOEs are in industries that are becoming more concentrated. Or maybe firms are merging to respond to the SOEs. What this does is I looked at what actually happened to concentration, and I looked at what would have happened to concentration if the SOEs hadn't been there. And what is on the vertical axis is what actually happened, and the horizontal axis shows what concentration would have looked like in the absence of SOEs. And what you see is that in some industries, in particular civil engineering, which is basically construction, is the top left point, concentration in that sector increased by more than 5 percentage points, but without the SOEs, it would have actually declined by more than 5. And as you see, most of the sectors are above the 45-degree line. There was an increase in concentration because the SOEs were there. Without them, that increase wouldn't have happened. I want to give you some idea of who these firms are and the sectors they're in. So as I said, and these are all sectors where, including the SOEs, concentration increased by more than 4 or 5 percentage points relative to what it would have been if those SOEs had not been included. And some of the sectors are, as I mentioned, civil engineering, mining support, mining of coal and lignite, professional services, petroleum and natural gas. So you might say, well, this doesn't really affect global competition because these are largely import competing sectors. Civil engineering and construction grew up in part with the fast growth in infrastructure in China. But as infrastructure has slowed down in China, these firms have started to look outward. So we see them building the metro system in Mecca, refurbishing a bridge in New York, building a tower in Moscow, building a resort in Jamaica, et cetera, et cetera. So these firms are competing with the former leaders from Europe and Japan and US, and they're state-owned. And in that field in particular, it's going to have a big impact on trade because once you win those contracts, a lot of the machinery and materials are going to be imported from China. I'd also like you to keep in mind that even in an import-competing sector, a large state-owned firm can have monopsony power in terms of setting prices and such, which can affect buyers in other parts of the world. And finally, when we look at a more disaggregated group of tradable sectors, what you see is some industries where China is growing fast and there are concerns about competition, including metals that everybody knows about, manufacture of railways, auto parts is a sector that has been growing extremely fast, and so forth. So let me just say a few words about efficiency. So we've seen that overall concentration has declined, but it's increasing in some industries. The other question is, what does this say? Is the world becoming more efficient? Is it the most productive firms that are big and getting larger? And when we look at this question, we do find that the most productive firms are larger. So this is just a simple percentile taking out industrial differences. So the 100th percentile or 99th percentile firms are the top 1% in size and going down. The top firms are indeed more productive, so that's a good thing. But when we compare overall firms with SOEs, what you see is that the SOEs are too big, or given their productivity. Or put a different way, for any size ranking of an SOE, it's less productive than a similar firm in the same industry. And we did a lot of regression analysis. I mean, these are just sort of baseline figures. There are a bunch of different reasons why you might see this, maybe just because China has more labor. But when you do the empirical work, what you do find is controlling for country effects, country industry effects, any other things that may be inherent to those firms, comparing state-owned firms and other Chinese firms. More productive firms are larger and grow faster overall in the data, which is good. This is especially true in tradables, so global allocative efficiency is stronger in the tradable sector, which is what you'd expect. But Chinese SOEs are too large and growing too fast given their productivity. Just to say a few words about putting this in context, we've seen that Nick Lardy and other people's work has shown that the private sector has grown faster in China. I won't go through everything here, but just to say these results are for a handful of sectors, and they're for a very specific time period. So there's no inconsistency here. Other work also finds that SOEs are large and growing in some sectors and gaining importance as the smaller SOEs have been privatized, but the larger ones, this grasp the large and let go of the small kind of policy. And finally, this is my last slide to conclude. So on aggregate, global concentration is falling, so we don't need to worry as much about a rise in market power, for example. And part of this is because of emerging market firms that are now taking share from the incumbent industry leaders from US and Europe and Japan. But Chinese SOEs in particular raise global concentration, whether you look at broad sectors or tradables in a handful of industries. And finally, that the evidence for global allocative efficiency is strong, but SOEs are distorting it. And I think one concern about this is that from a trade policy perspective, a worry is that if firms from US and elsewhere feel like they're not competing in a level playing field, this is going to raise pressure for protection, and that's something we've seen recently and I think does need to be addressed. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
So I am going to be quite brief because I am not presenting new research results. In fact, what I will speak to today is largely based on what I would call stylized facts, but others might call cliches about China's SOEs, but basically to give a policy gloss on why US officials and officials from other parts of the world should also care. So what we've heard from Nick today, and I think is well established in the literature, is that SOEs are a concern for China. They are less profitable, more indebted, and ultimately less productive. And so China has a very significant interest in figuring out how to reform this sector. As we all know, it has grappled with the challenge that the SOE sector is very core to the Communist Party's ideology, the Communist Party's perception of its role in that society and its grip on power. And we also know that there are some very significant vested interests among leading party families and their close relationship with significant SOEs, which appear to act as obstacles to the kinds of rapid reforms that were promised in the third plenum document that Nick read from a little earlier. But what I'm going to talk about today is that while we should all hope for China to be successful in its reforms, it will bring it closer to the kind of rules-based global economy that I think we're all interested in seeing in the decades to come. But it's also a very specific concern for for policymakers in other countries in the nearer term. So the issues I'll flag today: number one, the macroeconomic issues raised by the SOE sector; number two, the trade distortions, which Carolyn described in greater detail; and three, some of the national security issues that are raised by foreign direct investment by SOEs. And then finally, I'll talk about a couple of different approaches that policymakers might consider. One is essentially encouraging further reform in China, and the other is trying to insulate one's own economy from the spillover effects of the SOE distortions. So first of all, macroeconomically, the issue here is that SOEs are part of the problem of China's excess saving. We know that the dividends that SOEs pay to the Chinese government are extremely low, and moreover, at this point, almost all of those dividends are then recycled within the state sector. They are not transferred to the budget for use, for example, on social programs or other spending items. And so essentially the fact that SOEs have this incentive to retain their earnings and to save too much is part of this overall problem, which contributes obviously to China's current account surpluses, more recently to China's capital outflows. Now, one of the very few specific numerical pledges in the third plenum document was that by 2020, China would start remitting 30% of its SOE dividends to the budget, which I think a lot of us were very encouraged by. But what we've discovered over time is that pledge has to be understood very specifically as that is the share of the dividends that will go to the budget. It is not the share of the profits that will be paid out in dividends. And the share of the profits that's paid out in dividends is still very low, the order of 15%. And so we're talking about 30% of 15%, not 30% of SOE profits. Then I think perhaps very intuitively, we have a concern that SOEs will distort trade. If insofar as they receive privileged access to financing, they get underpriced inputs, low-priced land, better regulatory treatment, then clearly that creates a competitive distortion in the Chinese market, but frankly also a spillover distortion to anyone competing with these firms or trying to provide goods to China. Now, we also know that SOEs aren't unique in this respect. There are national champions and frankly local champions within China which also receive privileged treatment, but I think it's fair to say, and most people believe, that SOEs routinely receive benefits far beyond what most private firms in China receive. Now, a specific distortion that has, I think, very direct political concern for the US and for other governments lately has been the issue of excess capacity, and specifically the fact that insofar as SOEs face softer budget constraints and hence are able to run losses for longer, they will be under less pressure to adjust, to reduce capacity relative to their market competitors in other countries. And as a result, the companies that will be forced to remove this excess capacity will be the market ones and not the Chinese ones, even though the big ramp up in capacity came in China. So that's a very specific concern. Then in addition, and this comes to some extent to the point that Carolyn was making. Now, SOEs in China, obviously, by definition, all report up to some level of the Chinese government. And in principle, the Chinese government can also direct them to collude. Now, there have been cases in the US courts where this has proven to be a very specific problem with respect to price fixing. And so this is an additional challenge that we need to grapple with. And finally, as I said, this is in China, but it's also something that affects behavior here in the United States. national security. I think that this has been an area of back and forth between the United States and China for many years. China has always told us that we should consider state-owned enterprises to be commercial, operating without government direction, entirely following business logic. There have been certainly some cases of investments that have caused us all to scratch our heads and wonder whether that's really all that's going on. Clearly, there are larger geopolitical competitive issues between the two countries, and so there, in the statute of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, there is a requirement of a higher degree of scrutiny for direct investment by state firms. That already exists, but now I'm sure many in this room are aware that there have been a chorus of calls for somehow a tougher approach or even an outright ban on state-owned enterprise investment in the United States. Now, my argument would be that, well, first of all, that as I was saying earlier, the distinction between SOEs and private is not quite as hard and fast as you might think, and so certainly there's reason for continuing to scrutinize both private and state enterprises, but not particularly blocking either. And second, with respect to SOEs in particular, given that China has expressed a very strong interest in maintaining SOE access to the U.S. market, that is in itself a point of leverage. Even if we in the United States believe that fundamentally FDI is positive for the United States, it creates jobs here, it improves productivity in the United States, the fact that China wants it is a rare bargaining chip that should be used very wisely, and we should think very hard about to what end we should use it, and certainly not give it away by blocking FDI from SOEs altogether. So finally, in terms of the broad policy space, as I suggested at the beginning, really there are two approaches that one could take. In the United States, we have been negotiating a bilateral investment treaty with China for many years. That the text of the treaty includes a number of provisions that would address some of these specific distortions and create a much more level playing field for investment, but also for trade. And also in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and there was a whole chapter on state-owned enterprises. As you know, China was not a party to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but it certainly was scrutinizing the text very closely with an eye either to potentially joining the TPP at some point in the future or simply understanding that this was our effort to lay out what a 21st century trade agreement and what a 21st century trade rule should look like, and therefore that it was at one point or another going to have to comply with it. So essentially using the rules-based system to encourage reform by the Chinese. The other approach, as I was saying earlier, is essentially to wall off the U.S. economy to try to address the spillovers without actually paying any attention to whether China was moving forward with reform or not. And the kinds of tools that then would be used would be trade remedies, anti-dumping, countervailing duties, maybe revamping U.S. competition policy to address some of the competition issues that are raised by SOE collusion, and finally by toughening the CFIUS rules to either block SOE FDI or subject it to even tighter scrutiny. Now, in the Obama administration, we certainly didn't forswear the enforcement-based approach, but fundamentally we relied to a large degree also on trying to create these new sets of international rules. The sense, at least from the early rhetoric of the Trump administration, is it's going to be very heavily focused on an enforcement-based approach. The real concern there is that if anything, if they were to go too hard on that to provoke a Chinese backlash, you might actually get a backing away from the path of SOE reform in China rather than progress in that area. So thank you.
As you can see, random abuse occurs at the Peterson Institute. Thank you, Rory. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Nick. These are very rich topics. Rory drawing on very good reflections about his experience. And of course, Carolyn with her research in progress and Nick in his ongoing research. I just want to reemphasize before we open it up for questions and comments a couple things. First, in line with Nick's long-term research and taking Rory's comments into account, I think we all believe that there is some distinction between the true private parts of the Chinese economy and the public sector, and that the private parts of the Chinese economy have been hugely beneficial to China and the world. I think the second thing I want to stress is there are different ways of looking at the data, and so there are obviously different perspectives. I'd like to ask Nick, Carolyn, and in that order, Rory got the last word, so I'm going to skip him, if they want to offer any reflections on their colleagues' comments before we open it to the floor. Nick, briefly.
Okay. There's no question that Chinese SOEs are bigger than ever. This is, as I said, partly organic growth and partly the huge number of mergers. The organization that controls the 200 largest state-owned non-financial corporations, which was created back in about 2003, 2004, has subsequently merged down the number of these firms to about 102. So they've all been growing, but there are a tremendous amount of mergers, and when you rank these firms by revenue, they are gigantic. If you rank them by return on assets, they'd probably be at the bottom of the list. But if you rank them by revenue, they're very, very large. So any inclusion of these firms in measures of global concentration, obviously it's going to raise up global concentration because they're so large. Going to the question of whether or not they're distorting global markets, I think these firms in and of themselves, I agree with a lot of what Rory said. The state itself introduces a certain amount of distortions. I'm not sure the SOEs themselves do. They're not very big exporters. They account for about 1.5% of global exports. They used to do 2/3 of China's exports. Now they do about 10% because they're less competitive. Their returns have gone down, so they're not successful exporters anymore. They're very big on the import side. But when you start looking at the commodities, it's oil, iron ore, coal. Oil is a very competitive global market. China's two big oil companies are only importing about 15% of globally traded oil. I think you would have a very hard case to make to say they're somehow influencing the global price. Iron ore, they're a huge importer. A very large share of globally traded iron ore goes to China, but there are hundreds and hundreds of steel companies doing the importing, and they're not colluding to try to influence the price. And if you talk to people in the industry, I think they believe it's a fairly competitive market. Well, I could go on, but I'm just saying there is, I think our presumption as economists is to think if concentration's going up, something bad could be happening, but showing in specific cases that it's actually happened is sometimes difficult.
Okay, Carolyn, do you have anything you want to offer on this?
I would just say I think I largely agree with Nick, and I think the problem isn't that large right now. I would add, though, that often you're an importer before you're an exporter. As recently as 2004, China was a net importer of steel, and we all know it's happened since. So I think just saying, well, if you're an importer, then it's, I mean, in addition to the potential pricing issues, that's not necessarily enough. The other thing is the SOEs tend to be in upstream industries, so then it ends up feeding down into the pricing of all sorts of industries. So I think there are different ways in which it does. And finally, and I think this is the area where we'd agree the most, is that the other point of the analysis is to say these firms are too big given how productive they are, or they're not productive enough given how large they are. And either way you cut it, China would be better off if they had a smaller share of the economy.
Very well said. Let me open it up to questions and comments. Our usual drill. Brad, do you want to go to the mic back there? I promised him the first question. Our usual drill, please identify yourself. Please make it a question, not a statement. Otherwise, I'll cut you off. There is a roving mic with Jessica at the front of the room. There's a standing mic at the back of the room. Please.
So a quick observation.
Please identify yourself.
Oh, sorry. Brad Setzer, Council on Foreign Relations. One of the stylized facts about the Chinese economy over the past 3 years is that the growth in goods imports has significantly lagged overall growth. So the goods import share of China's economy has gone down. Given that the argument here is that SOEs are less prevalent on the manufacturing side than on other sides, do you think that this phenomena is associated with the rise of China's state?
Thank you.
The rise of what?
Sorry, could you repeat the last line? This phenomena is associated with the rise of?
Chinese state enterprises, their strengthening role in the economy.
Thank you.
I don't think so. I think the biggest reason for declining imports relative to the size of the economy is the localization of production chains. And this is primarily an area of the economy that's dominated by foreign affiliates operating in China. In other words, they used to buy all their parts and components from Malaysia and Taiwan and Korea and so forth, but more and more of those firms have moved their production facilities to China to be closer to their clients. And the result is this processed imports, is what they call them. Processed imports as a share of total imports has declined quite significantly. It used to be almost 50%. I think now it's about 35%. So imports relative to GDP have declined, mostly through the role of foreign affiliates and where they're sourcing their inputs from.
Thank you. Rory or Carolyn, anything
I'd just
else?
add to that part of it is the slowdown in global trade altogether. So trade everywhere has slowed down dramatically, and so China needs less of these imports, in part just because it's trading less and exporting less, just like everybody, or it's not growing as fast as it was in the past.
Okay, next question, also at the back mic. Jessica, could you
Bob
move to the middle
Samuelson,
there?
Washington Post. It's a question for everybody. You've described something that happened, the retreat or the slowing down of the expansion of the private sector, but you haven't explained why it happened. Is this reflecting some sort of a political decision at the top that was communicated throughout the economy, or is it simply the peculiar workings of the marketplace in China, or something else?
Well, I think from the output point of view, the private sector, as I showed, and by I think second to the last slide, has not really slowed down. In the industrial sector, private firms are still growing twice as fast as state-owned firms. Where the change has come is investment. And if that were to continue, it could feed through to the growth of output. But so far, it's been of relatively short duration. So that's why I think it's potentially a problem for the future. But I think the slowdown in private investment is, due to factors that, to a considerable extent, are the result of state policy. Number one, not liberalizing access of private firms, including foreign firms, to the service sector, and allowing a financial system that directs a disproportionately large share of credit to money-losing state-owned companies. So I think the policy is very much involved.
Right.
I agree that policy is involved, but I think that the key lens to understand that is that what we've been seeing over the last 2-3 years is an effort by China to avoid too sharp an economic slowdown, and fundamentally that effort has manifested itself through various stimulus policies that have disproportionately benefited the state sector. So while there may not have been a policy meeting of the state council or the standing committee saying we need to increase the state's share of profits or output or whatever. That was what followed from policies that were aimed at supporting the economy.
Thank you. Next question, the gentleman with the mic.
Thank you. I am the Brazilian ambassador, and I'm very pleased to be here and seeing some people I used to meet when I was a visitor of IIE. For the last years, I was the chairman of the China-Brazil Business Council, and we did a very comprehensive study on Chinese investment in Brazil. And to a large extent, it did not reflect the trend which has just been presented with a lot of evidence. It need not to reflect, it used to reflect, but on the contrary now, the role or the share of the private sector is increasing. Now, I come back to the question which was put by my colleague from the Washington Post. Is this the deliberate result of a change in policy? Because you may remember the 13th plan emphasized the exposure to market practices, or may it also be the result of some different developments? First, the restructuring of...
Please don't make a speech. Please ask a question.
The question is it the result of other practices like the restructuring, the concern of banks in lending to the private sector for a question of risk, the expansion of investment, Chinese investment abroad, which was basically in the area of infrastructure and heavy equipment?
Thank you.
Well, in terms of the outbound investment, I think, a few years ago, it was mostly in natural resources. It was mostly by state companies. But in the last few years, that's changed. There's very much less investment in natural resources, and the role of state companies as a result has diminished substantially. If you take the case of the U.S., which is now one of the largest destinations for outbound investment, something like 2/3 of all the investment is being done by private companies. Now, there's still some, headline cases that involve state companies, but if you look at the aggregate numbers, the role of private companies in outbound investment into the U.S. market has increased quite substantially.
Let me just add something from the perspective of someone who does research on financial crises and fragility, not so much as a China expert. We have to understand that this is not an entirely different pattern than we saw in Korea or in Japan, or for that matter, in the U.S. savings and loan crisis. When, as Nick has written about in the past, also including with our colleague Morris Goldstein, if you have a financial system which has limited investment opportunities for savers and for perhaps legitimate reasons has limits on capital outflows, you're going to end up with distortions at a fundamental level in the market. And so the idea that there isn't some policy decision is just sort of organically growing up has to be seen against that background. That if you have a government that is committed to retaining a convoy system de facto and de jure for government-protected financial institutions, you will automatically have this kind of corruption, misallocation, overinvestment. That was true in Korea, that was true in Japan, that was true in Oklahoma. As our colleague Monica de Bola has pointed out with BNDES and it's like in Brazil, that's been true in Brazil. And so not everything fits the same pattern, but I think it is worth reminding people that this is a part of a general picture of the banking problems in China and financial development issues that Nick and other colleagues have worked on. It's not just about the party plenum. Next question, please. There, the gentleman in gray.
Hi, I'm Chen Wei from China Daily. I want you, as economists, to comment on Donald Trump's sort of a measure to tell U.S. company not to relocate abroad or outsource abroad. Is this some kind of a rise of a state in the U.S.? Thank you.
Okay, Rory, you can start.
So what we've seen so far is some rhetoric and threats that companies would face a border tax, but no clarity as to whether beyond the tweeting, companies will face a real shift in their incentives about where to locate production. The most specific proposal out there is the border adjustment tax proposal coming out of the House of Representatives that the administration seems partially to be embracing, and that would indeed have some effect on incentives for where companies will locate their production. That's not the same thing as state planning, to put it mildly. That would be creating a new set of rules that would affect incentives. That's very much in the classical mode of how the U.S. has done economic policy for years. It's certainly new that we've had a president who's attacked individual companies, but for the moment, we haven't seen any consequences beyond the rhetoric.
Carolyn, do you want to add anything on this point?
I would just say that it is having an effect. So we're hearing in different circumstances from different companies that for right now they're putting plans on hold. If they're thinking about moving for labor cost issues, they might still move if it's about market access. But it does seem to be having an effect, whether it's a macro effect or an individualized micro effect, and we don't know. And the long-term consequences of that are likely to be negative on productivity if you have this group of companies that aren't doing what's most efficient, and then especially if at some point the policy changes, then you could have a sudden and far more disruptive change in company behavior. So I think it's a concern for a lot of reasons, but talk, whether it's cheap or not, remains to be seen.
One more, again, reminder about putting this in a general context. For more than 30 years, going back to when Fred Bergsten commissioned work on FDI in the U.S. by Paul Krugman and the late Monty Graham, the Institute has been doing studies on the two-way benefits, the obvious benefits to developing economies of technology transfer, best practice, and competition when they receive foreign direct investment, but also the obvious benefits to the U.S. and other rich countries when they receive FDI. More recent studies we've published by Ted Moran and Lindsay Oldensky of Georgetown, for example, on the employment effects and R&D benefits of FDI into the U.S. Again, going back to some of the specifics Rory mentioned, we know in this congressional environment there will be concerns and possibly even broadening of the CFIUS process definitions. There will be these quid pro quo reciprocal threats, but we should not lose sight of the fact that fundamentally FDI two ways in the U.S.-China relationship, especially when done on a private sector to private sector basis, is of mutual benefit. And that's why the Chinese government and the previous administration were interested in the China-U.S. bilateral investment treaty. Let me ask the audience for a final question. The gentleman over there, Jessica, please.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. My name is Adam Siegel, not from CFR. I'm a reporter with MLEX, Market Insight. My background is as a trade attorney, and we all like to read economists and pretend like we know what you're talking about. So I'm going to ask you two questions. Feel free to take either one of them, anyone on the panel. The first major trade issue for trade attorneys going on is rising role of Chinese state in the economy. Is China trending toward or against market economy? Are they market economy? And the second question, we've had a complaint at the ITC by U.S. Steel recently where they allege anti-competitive behavior by Chinese firms in the steel sector. I'm curious for Nick and Carolyn how you differentiate truly private firms from firms that are registered as private entities in China but have associations with often state-controlled iron and steel organizations that are allegedly, according to this case, involved in these anti-competitive practices. And Rory, I'm curious from you whether or not you feel like U.S. trade remedies and trade agencies are nimble enough to deal with the rising role of SOEs. Thank you.
Thank you. Given the limits of time, but also because my colleagues really set out their more nuanced views rather than a yes-no of whether China's moving away from the market, I'd suggest that they answer the second of Mr. Siegel's questions. Please, starting with Carolyn, then Rory, then Nick.
Well, I don't know if I can answer your precise question. I just would say that I think we're going to see a lot more contingency protection. So I think there's going to be a lot more anti-dumping, countervailing duty cases, safeguards, and maybe some industry agreements. And just one thing to add in terms of talking about the SOEs that I looked at is they are sometimes in the tradable sectors in the type that you would see this type of protection against. So in addition to the metals and stuff we all know about, auto parts, for example, is another area where they've been growing, just dramatically fast and now have a big share of the U.S. market. And there's a few other sectors like that in the tradables where I think contingency protection is exactly what's going to happen.
Rory?
Well, I think the criteria for ownership in China are fairly clear. State company is one that's wholly owned by the state or majority owned by the state, or a dominant owner is the state. There can even be firms in which the dominant owner is private, but by agreement they let the state company take the lead, and it would be classified as a state-owned company. And there are similar rules for private firms based on ownership shares. So, yeah, some private firms have close connections with the government, but there's a fundamental difference between private companies in China and state companies in China. That is, in the industrial sector, for example, private companies are earning a return on assets of around 8 or 9%, depending on the year, and state companies are earning 2 to 3%. So, you put these industries in different ownership categories, the performance is fundamentally different. So I think there's a difference between these two types of companies.
Very good. Rory, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so first, on the question of market economy status, clearly state ownership of the means of production is one of the U.S. statutory criteria. That will remain a problem, and unless Congress decides to amend those criteria, I guess we're heading to a WTO dispute. On the issue of whether the U.S. agencies are nimble enough to use trade remedies, I mean, there's certainly a lot of discussion of whether there should be more resources made available to the Commerce Department to bring these kinds of disputes. I will say that a challenge that we faced consistently was that we would be asked often by the labor movement to self-initiate anti-dumping or countervailing duty cases. The problem there is that all of the data that is needed to do so is in the hands of private industry, and frankly, U.S. industry is extremely ambivalent for the most part, with the exception of certain key sectors, is extremely ambivalent about the use of these trade remedies, often because it straddles the Pacific, and it's the same companies have operations in China, in the United States, or supply chains that they do not want to disrupt. So even adding a lot of manpower to the Commerce Department would not overcome fundamental resistance from the industries themselves to bringing more cases. So I think that it's very easy to talk about enforcement as a slogan, but in practice, it's going to be much harder.
One final note on steel before we close. I mean, steel, like textiles and certain agriculture, is one of those industries that keeps being with us of disproportionate importance politically and in trade negotiations, even though it is not a huge source of employment, a huge source of value added, or a huge source of innovation. As our colleagues at the Cato Institute have estimated, restrictions on U.S. steel very expensively would protect jobs when there are 40 jobs using steel throughout the rest of the economy. And our colleague Gary Huffbauer, at intervals throughout the last 10 years, goes through the exercise of showing how U.S. government protection efforts on steel cost the American taxpayer vast amounts. I realize, Mr. Siegel, that was not your point, but it has to be said. And similarly, picking up on Nick's point about the very obvious differences in productivity on very prima facie labels, it is very important to recognize that companies, even in the U.S., can have undue political ties, even without, strictly speaking, being state-owned, if they serve the interests of people, ownership interests of people in positions of high power. And we should worry a little bit about not being too sanctimonious to other countries when we are going down a path that seems to favor accumulations of private power in connection to government positions. Finally, I think it is important, however, to recognize that China, all this other stuff aside, has added more steel capacity in the last few years than the rest of the world combined at a time when its domestic needs for steel are declining. And so there is legitimate room for the U.S. and other Western economies, plus India and others, and Brazil, to engage with China about ways of working off this vast overcapacity. That is something where if the U.S. administration wishes to serve the interests of the people in the world, rather than a very narrowly defined vision of what the steel industry in the U.S. should do, they could constructively pursue at the G20. And that is something that I believe, given my discussions with Chinese and European officials, others would be very open to. On that note, let me turn to my colleagues and thank Carolyn Freund, Nicholas Lardy, Rory MacFarquhar, who I think took us through an excellent set of research and views on how to think about the resurgence of the state and the Chinese economy. This meeting is adjourned.